All right, welcome to Better Mental Health, a podcast for men looking to build a resource and community around destigmatizing mental health. I'm Blair.
I'm Jamie.
And I'm Blake. And today we're diving into the loneliness epidemic that's really affecting all of us collectively as a society. But we'll be exploring how this crisis uniquely impacts men, the challenges they face, cultural factors at play, and what we can do to hopefully foster deeper connection in community. So part of our preparation for this episode was reading a book called Seek You by Kristen Radke. And one of the things I thought would be interesting to dive into first. So she shares an experience about moving to a new city and experiencing probably one of the loneliest times of her life. And that was very relevant to me. I had a similar experience moving to a new city, and I could definitely relate to that. That was probably the loneliest time I ever felt. So I thought we could start with maybe sharing our own experiences of when we felt the loneliest in our lives. So one of you guys want to jump in first with the loneliest experience you've had, loneliest you've ever felt?
Yeah, I'm just gonna hop right in. Hopefully you're all right with that, Jamie.
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, the
Yeah.
moving to a new city is like so apt. I feel like maybe everybody can relate to that one because I mean, so I finished college with you guys, and then I moved in with our buddy and his family. I did the whole thing where like I was like, I have an internship, an unpaid internship in LA. And my buddy Matt lives in LA, so I'm like, I'll live with him for a little bit, and then not realizing it's like an hour and a half away because LA is insanely huge. I moved in with him for a little bit, but then after that, I was like, I need to be out on my own. I'm living in this family home. And then I moved into an apartment in West Hollywood with the scientist from Craigslist that I found. And it was like that first time living kind of quote unquote on my own. And holy moly, like it was so lonely. I have journals from back then that I read, yeah, maybe a few years ago. And I was like, God, what was I even doing? It was just like I had nobody to like hang out with. I didn't branch out of my like comfort zone and go, and the only things that you were able to do were like going out. And I was like at an unpaid internship, so I wasn't going to go to a bar. I remember going to a bar with my roommate like the first time I was down there, the first night or something, and it was like a $16 cocktail in like 2011. And I was like, well, that's the last time I'm going out. Like, I can't spend that money. So yeah, I just ended up being down in LA for so long solo. And like my buddy was, an hour and a half away from where I ended up living. So it was an extremely lonely time. I would like go to Chipotle, eat dinner or lunch, whatever it was, journal. And it was just but and you had a similar experience, or Jamie, have you moved to a new city like solo? Or is that experience that
No,
you
never solo. Yeah,
Mhm.
no, not really. Well, I mean, moving to St. Louis, I guess I was dating Lauren at the time, but I moved in with Brett as a roommate. But I don't want to jump away from your story. I'm curious in
Yeah.
that loneliness, if you were aware that you were lonely. Like, was there an awareness that like, oh, this is a
Mhm.
lonely experience, or were you just sort of like now looking back on it, like, fuck, that was weird.
Yeah. I think I knew I was lonely because I wasn't interacting with a ton of people, but I still the thing that's weird about maybe it's part of like this loneliness epidemic that we're currently in, but it's like I was still connected to you all. I was
Hmm.
making like fantasy football videos and it was kind of fun and I was
Right.
doing that sort of stuff. So I still had things that would take me away from like that feeling of like, wow, I'm literally not interacting with anybody in person. I feel like there was a part of me that knew that I was like, I want more friends. That's kind of always been the case, honestly, since graduating college. I'm like, how do you even make friends as a
Hmm.
man and as an adult, and then as a man? Yeah, so there was an awareness, but I think it was kind of in the back of my mind and not at the forefront a ton.
Yeah. I
Hmm.
think it's hard to recognize like in the moment, like just to say like, wow, I'm lonely. You feel it,
Hmm.
but you don't necessarily like put it into words, especially when you are in that lonely state, you're not really talking to people. So you're not necessarily putting a lot of those things into words. But I think it's really cool that you were journaling a lot in that time frame. Do you recall anything that you like read during that time that jumped out? Like, oh wow, I was really like I was feeling loneliness. Maybe you hadn't expressed it in words, but it was very like clear from what you wrote.
Yeah. Oh man, I wish I could pull out something specific at the moment. I just remember that I think I was just having like this kind of circular cycle of feelings that was I remember reading when I was reading through my journals. I think I had a journal in high school, not anything consistent, but um that I had read and then started to journal again and getting into the habit. And I was like reading back through them now, like a few years ago. I was like, was certain patterns that have just continued and were so obvious. That was like, I wish I like had more friends. I wish I was able to like, have the drive to like go out and find that next not necessarily friend thing. I was also very career oriented. I was like, I need to be doing things. And I was working at like I was down in LA. I was like, and I was pursuing the film industry, whatever that meant to me. I literally was just like in college. I was like, I like movies. I should go to LA. Um, yeah, little did I
Yeah.
know, it's like, unless you know somebody or you're incredibly rich, like, you're not or you're just, like, incredibly passionate,
Yeah.
then you're not gonna
Yeah.
make it down there. So,
Well, and what's really
yeah,
interesting, sorry to interrupt, but like
no,
I kind of want to touch on something you said because you were living in LA, you were living in like Hollywood,
yeah,
West Hollywood. It's not like you were living in the middle of nowhere. And
no,
the that's the interesting thing about loneliness is you could be literally in a big city, like you were, like I was at one point, and still you walk outside and you'll see people all over. Like there is
mhm,
no absence of people. It's purely a feeling of disconnection that you have.
mhm,
Just because there's people around doesn't mean you're feeling that connection that we as humans need.
yeah,
For
100%.
sure.
Yeah, I feel like there were times where I would be around people on, like, a shared patio or deck, and there would be a part of me that was like, "Do I want to engage?" And I was like, but it's like, what's the point?" Like, I'm not
Hmm.
necessarily gonna see them as, like, somebody that I would get really close to. I'm just, like, immediately cutting off the possibility before even giving it a chance. And there's
Hmm.
probably
Hmm.
some aspect of, like, self-preservation there that I am now starting to realize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
And in the book, it talks about there's different periods for most people. There are like three different stages where most people experience the most amount of loneliness typically.
mhm,
And for a lot of people, it is right after college because you've gone from your life being structured in a way where you're living by a schedule that you've become used to, and a lot of times there's other people that are associated with that schedule, and so you're in some ways just connected purely by that schedule and just the ritual of like seeing each other and having a shared experience of going to a class together or taking a test, and then once that just ends, then all of a sudden you're trying to integrate yourself into some type of new schedule, and there's no one there to set that schedule for you in many cases. And then a lot
mhm,
of times it is a period of transition because maybe you are moving away from where your college was or from your hometown or things like that. So it's one of those periods of life where a lot of people do experience loneliness.
yes. And now that you're bringing all that up, I'm curious if, like, because our experience, I feel like we need to put a little, like, asterisk on our experience in college, because like, the way that our college was, it was in a not even a town, it was in a village of Southern Illinois on the bluffs of the Mississippi, so there was 400 or 500 students, so everybody knew everybody, small little pond, and then not only that, you didn't live off campus, you lived in dorms for 4 years. All 4 years of your college experience our college experience were in dorms. We went from literally, like, a community, a forced community to, like, "All right, go be in the real world." It's
Yeah.
like, "What do you mean I
Yeah.
can't walk down the hall and, like, play some video games with my
Right.
buddies?"
I think that's
Yeah.
one of the benefits of me ending up in St. Louis after college there was like a little bit more of that transition from, because St. Louis was close to where our college was, and there's a lot of that community. The Christian Science community was in St. Louis because of that, and so
Mhm.
a lot of people we knew were still in that area, and so there was an immediate sort of like buffer for me to have some people I knew and was able to hang out and connect with a lot of people in St. Louis at the time. I'm curious, like, because I'm the only one of the three that didn't read the book. What the other two like loneliness sections of life tend to be for people other than post college.
Yeah, so I think the other two were like late 50s, mid late 50s, which is usually, I think, for a lot of people because they have kids. And
Mm,
then at around that time, their kids might be leaving the home. And then
right.
the other time was like in your early to mid 80s, which
Mm,
is maybe when, for some people, they may be moving to like an old folks home, a nursing home or something like that. Those are the periods of time where a lot of people experience those big transitions and big life changes. And then at that age too, in your 80s, obviously a lot of your peers, start
yeah.
to pass away. And so it's a transition in that sense too, where literally your friends are are moving on and you may be moving into a new environment as well. So
Yeah.
those are three periods of life that are kind of
Yeah.
highlighted in the book.
Well, I don't want to get away from it. Jamie, what was your loneliest experience?
Yeah. As I'm thinking about it and processing this, like I'm finding myself getting internally avoidant and emotional about it because I think that for a lot of my life, there's been the threat of loneliness. And I think that it's hard for me to talk about. And I think it relates to growing up in Christian Science. And I think it's one of the things that is difficult for me to understand. But, being in Christian Science, it was such a small religion that there weren't a lot of other people in it. So in my high school community and in my schooling, I didn't know anybody or didn't connect with anybody who was in Christian Science, and then didn't have a lot of people to talk to outside of that. And I know we've talked about this before, but it just made me feel very isolated, I think, from my peers. And there was a certain point in high school where I was super self-conscious, just like, incredibly aware of the fact that other people could judge me and were thinking about me in certain ways. And so I think I'm surprised that high school doesn't come up as one of the three times that people can be the loneliest, because that to me was one of my loneliest times. Was there was just this period of time where I didn't fit in with my friends. I didn't fit in the Christian Science version of the world. And I was super self-conscious. And it just was like, where do I go? I didn't have anybody to talk to in the therapy context, and therapy would have been so, so, so good for me at that point.
Yeah.
Like it just would have helped me process through this anxiety and this loneliness that I had at that point.
Yeah.
And so I feel like there's this wall that's continued to stay up, and maybe I'm finding a place to blame, like Christian Science or something like that. But I feel like there's this wall of loneliness that I've sort of continued to have throughout my life where I don't feel super comfortable connecting with people in a way that makes me feel not lonely. It's hard for me to find that.
Was that new people specifically?
Yeah, especially new people. Like I
Mm.
feel less that way. And like I feel good with the community that I have, and I feel like I'm building more solid community now more than ever. But yeah, when Blair, when you were mentioning like you're sitting on the deck being like, should I start talking to these people or not? I feel like that all the time. Whenever I would go to the skate park, I would want to start connecting with people. Whenever I'd go surfing, I want to start connecting with people. Whenever I go, we're in a co-op now with Avid for Avid's school, and there are these really cool dads that I could like easily start, talking to and connecting with. But I'm just intimidated by, one, the process of connecting with people, and two, I feel like there's this internal sense of, will they like me? Or I don't know what it is that I'm trying to protect, but it feels like that high school version of myself has sort of run its course through my entire life and stuck around till now. And I don't know if that's unique to the male experience or if that's unique to me, but trying to break it down, it's hard to, I feel like I'm processing it in real time, so it's hard to explain
Well,
the
I
whole
No,
I
thing.
love that you are, man.
I get it. I mean, I can totally relate to that. I think as introverts, it's like
Yeah.
this always this like push and pull. Like I want to connect with people, but I also want there's a like an underlying fear of rejection, as well
Hmm.
as like I want my own space and my own peace as well, and you're always
Yeah.
fighting that.
Yeah.
But I think in reading this book and just thinking about this a little bit more, I mean, we are all we are all looking for connection,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
chances are that if you're feeling that way around that like group of dads, there's probably one of those guys that's feeling the same way
Yeah.
too. It's like,
Oh,
oh, it'd be kind of
absolutely.
cool to connect with this Jamie guy. If
He
only he would ever come
surfs,
up and talk to me.
skateboards.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it seems like, and then they're like, he's too cool for me to hang out with. That's how I would feel. If someone was like, yeah,
Yeah.
just got back from surfing, I'd be like, oh man, all right, too cool for me.
It's too cool. It's too cool for me.
There were two things that you said that were like kind of had held weight in your decision whether or not to like talk to somebody. It was this kind of self-conscious part of like, oh, I don't know if they'll like
Yeah.
me, or I interpreted the other one as like the energy that it would take to like create a new connection that would be worth like
Hmm.
fostering into the future. I'm
Yeah.
curious if one of those feels like a little bit more for you in those moments.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good summary, because I think that it's both, and it's hard to know which one's really there, because it's like, yeah, sometimes you invest in putting in the energy to someone, and then they end up being not somebody you want to like really invest your time with, and that scares me, because then I have to wind down that connection and scale it
Mhm.
back, and it's like, oh, I put in the energy to hang out with somebody, and to be honest, it's really hard for me to trust that specifically men are going to be in a category of men that I would want to connect with and talk to, because I don't know that they're willing to be vulnerable in a way that I would like in a friendship. So that's one layer of it. That's sort of the like, I don't know if it's worth the energy. And then the self-conscious part of that is like, well, they might not like me anyways. And, it might, all that sort of just piles into one bundle. And then I just cut it off. It's not worth it.
Yeah.
So I don't know which one's more important.
Yeah.
I think they both really
I'm
play a big part.
I am convinced that I feel like even with men, I think most men do want to have those deeper connections. It's not so much that they don't want it, it's that they're just super uncomfortable with it and they don't know
Yeah.
how to go there. And to
Mhm.
your point, Jamie, it's when you're, connecting with somebody new, it's like, well, is this person going to be able to go there? And it's not necessarily would they want to or not. It's just like they might be totally uncomfortable doing that. And
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
then it's will they ever get to that point, and how much effort it needs to go in on your end to help with that. So that is an overwhelming sort of like thing that to have in the back of your mind when you're meeting somebody new.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, for sure.
would you say then that like in terms of your overall loneliest experience, because
Yeah.
you had a little bit of a different experience than me and Blair in that you were dating Lauren
Mhm.
coming out of college, and so you had
Yeah.
that partnership
Yeah.
that a lot of people
Right.
are looking for, especially like
You
when
moved in
you're
with
in
a
the
friend.
early 20s and stuff.
Yeah.
Was that?
Yeah, there
Yeah.
was no point where I feel like I experienced this post college, like a little bit right out of college. I went and lived with my parents in California, and then moved to St. Louis pretty quickly. And so I don't feel like I had that experience. It really feels more like I can't pinpoint a moment aside from high school and being deeply lonely in high school. And to I think that, when we've moved to California out here, it's taken me a while to feel like we have community out here, but I've always had Lauren, and I feel like I've always had you guys as this sense of connection and community for me. But I've been afraid at points in my life that I'm going to eventually, like, one of the fears I have is that I'm going to grow old, and not to say that my dad is doing things wrong or that it's bad the way he's living his life, but he doesn't have any deep male friendships. And so I'm afraid that I will end up like my dad, where I don't have deep male friendships that I can go just get a, coffee with, or go on a walk with, or like go hang out with. And I'm grateful that Blair lives in San Francisco, because I have Blair here, and I have I'm starting to build a little bit more community now, but I think moving out here was the closest. It's taken probably 5 years before we actually had like more friendships. Like we have couple friends, but I don't have like a group of guys that I go hang out with. And it's like just now I'm texting with like Blair, Dane, and Stefan about going to a concert. It's like, wow, that's kind of cool. Like
Yeah.
maybe they want to be our friends or something, and something like that. So, and I know that Dane and Stefan have listened to the podcast. So if they end up listening to this,
Shout out.
yeah, shout out. I want to be your friend. Yeah.
Well, all right. So I'm having like a lot of thoughts about like community coming up. This is
Yeah.
definitely a tied to loneliness, but I'm gonna like pin that and then ask Blake to hear a little bit more about your loneliest experience because I know that one
Yeah.
I can relate to a lot.
Well, first, so my loneliest experience was definitely when I moved to a new city. I moved to Chicago and didn't know many people.
Big
So I'll
city.
talk about that. But first, I do want to say that, Jamie, I agree with you. For me, high school was also a lonely time. And I didn't really think about it that way until you said that. But I think that's
Yeah.
because in high school, it was like I was maybe fooled by the fact that I was always around people. And
Mm-hmm.
whether I was at school, just around other students, whether they were like friends or not, then at home with family, my family was pretty much always around. Somebody was usually around the house. And so it felt like there was always people around. But again, as I've been, read this book and thinking about this more, just being around people doesn't necessarily make for
Right.
for like you to not feel lonely. And I think looking back on it now, I would say that was a lonely period of my life as well because I was very much in the same spot as you, like super self-conscious. I had friends, but nobody that I felt like I was super connected to. But of course, anytime I think about like the loneliest time of my life, I definitely just jumped to Chicago when I first
Mm-hmm.
moved there because that felt more like true isolation too. Like I
Mm-hmm.
had my own apartment, had gone through a breakup leading up to all that, and I was, working at in a semi new role, so new people at work, and
Was that your first kind of major breakup then?
yeah, for sure, yeah.
Okay.
So it was a painful breakup. So it was like kind of reeling from that new city, and I was living by myself. So if I wasn't at work, I would come home and it would be an empty apartment, no pets or anything either. And I would do kind of what you did, Blair. Like I'd like grab Chipotle on the way home or something, or pizza or something like that, and I'd watch some shows or maybe play Xbox or something, and then just go to bed alone. And
Yeah.
that repetition of just doing that over and over, where if I wasn't at work, I'd be at home, like basically not talking to anybody. That isolation was definitely the most like acute sense of loneliness that I felt because it wasn't just a lack of connection; it was that lack of even just social interaction. And in the book, they talk about the scientist who did all these, they're really pretty terrible experiments with monkeys. But
Oh
one of
yeah.
the things that he did was he would isolate monkeys for like extended periods of time from like their community. And then when it tried to reintegrate these monkeys back into their community, they would hide in a corner and the other monkeys would not accept them back sometimes. And as we know, like as humans, we're very social, just like primates are.
Yeah.
Another reference from the book was that in olden times, if somebody was banished from their community or their tribe, that was basically a death sentence because we need connection, we need community really to survive. So I think when you go to the very extreme of just like feeling like you're totally isolated, that's when that intense loneliness comes in. I'm trying to think of like, what helped get me out of that. And I think
Hmm.
for me, I did kind of have I felt like it was a rock bottom point where I just like, uh, I had just been dealing with this for so long and I was just feeling terrible. And and I actually think it was something really minor. Like I think I lost like in our fantasy football league or something like that.
Yeah.
And I had been
That's
super
not minor.
invested in that because I didn't have, yeah, it's a big deal. But I had been like super invested in that because I didn't really have anything else going on. So that I'd put a lot of like my mental energy into that. And then I don't know, I must have lost by like barely a few points or something. But everything else just came like crashing down on me at the same point. And I just had this total breakdown, just sobbing, crying for like, I don't know, an hour. And
Wow.
and I
I've
just
not heard of
like
this.
remember kind of like coming out of this and just, all right, something's not working. This is not working for me. I guess I always knew I had the option of, if I really wanted to, my parents probably would have let me like move back home with them. But for whatever reason, I decided I was gonna stick it out a little bit longer. But I said, if I'm gonna do that, I need to figure out what's not working. And I think at that point I did identify, I don't know if it was consciously, but I did identify I need to have some more of this social interaction. And I think I signed up for a kickball league and
Nice.
some other things like that, and just started slowly just getting back into this more social structure, just connecting with people, and even if it was surface level stuff,
Yeah.
Yeah.
like kickball. Because I think the longer you're isolated, the harder it is to get out of that, because you build patterns, you build habits, you build repetition, and that was very much the case for me. So like just doing something like that, like, oh, I'm going to go play kickball for an hour once a week. That was hard at first. It at least helped me to start like, okay, I can do this. I can start connecting with other humans again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds
That's
silly,
amazing.
but it's like so, yeah, so awesome that you did that, that you like had the awareness that you hit the bottom and you hit your bottom, and that you were like going to just take little steps to build back into
Yeah.
community. And then was there ever a point where you're like, oh, like I'm out of the woods a bit?
Yeah, it wasn't like a overnight type of thing. It was just a slow reintegration, I guess. Okay, I could do that. What else could I do? And part of it too is like I just started. Sometimes when you like sign up for something or you like commit to something, it's easier to commit, and then later you're like, I wish I hadn't done that. But now I'm committed, so I have to go.
Yep.
Yeah.
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 So just taking like the step of like, okay, I'll sign up for this thing, or I'll tell somebody I'll go to
Yeah.
this event or whatever. And then even in the moment when I didn't really want to go, I would be like, well, I committed, so I
Yeah.
have to go.
I
Um,
Mhm.
love that.
yeah,
That's such a cool way to do it. I imagine for so many people, so many men out there, and people in general, there's probably so much of this isolation, and just it's so easy to live chronically online now and feel
yeah,
like you have some type of community just by scrolling or watching somebody's vlog, thinking you're a part of their life, whatever it is that makes you feel connected to people. But I feel like there's no replacement for actually having real community. And I imagine a lot of our society would be better for it if we had more community. Like I think a lot of the reason we have Trump as president is because of lonely men.
Yeah.
I,
I
I was
think.
just gonna say, I think this is like a good transition to like, because you mentioned like how easy it is to be chronically online
Yeah.
today. I think I was almost, yeah, maybe we were all a little bit lucky in that at that point in our lives, like the internet was definitely early 20s. The internet was, obviously it wasn't like it was a brand new thing at that point. But people
Hmm.
like Andrew Tate weren't really a thing at that point.
Hmm.
It wasn't as common for people to be spending as much time online. And
Mhm.
nowadays, to your point, I think if you're feeling lonely, you're feeling isolated, what are you going to do? You're probably bored at home, so you're spending your time online. You still have that urge to find community in some sense. And then there's a lot of guys falling down this sort of like alt-right pipeline of like listening to these sort of like bro podcasts that might be like, oh, it's a
Yeah.
fitness podcast, but actually it's got
Hmm.
some like misogyny behind it as well. And I think a lot of people
Yeah.
find their way to somebody like Andrew Tate through that.
Jordan
Do
Peterson
you
is a good
guys?
example.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson. I mean, I
Yep.
read his one of his first books
I did too. It's great.
um,
Great
in
book.
my 20s. Now I feel like he's gone down a very interesting
Yeah.
path. And at one point in my life, I probably could have seen myself falling down that rabbit hole a
Hmm.
little bit further. Do you guys think so as well?
Oh yeah, man. I feel like I could have gone the way of the grift, you know,
Hmm.
or, been attracted to that for sure.
Yeah,
Um, yeah. And I think a lot of that comes from like a not having a full sense or an idea or an example of like masculinity. I mean, everybody's
Yeah.
like, oh, these guys are like, well, real men are.
Right. I was talking to my brother-in-law yesterday, actually telling him we were going to do this podcast. And he was like, "Oh, have you heard about this theory that's out there that the reason that Trump won is because of," and I mean, it's not that crazy of a theory, but it's, and I'm going to try and explain it well, but it's basically that liberal men have fallen in line with the idea that we need to step back and let, minorities and women be more of the leaders and sort of amplify this feminist message. And because they stepped back, there hasn't been liberal male leadership in a way that men can look up to, and it's given sort of created this vacuum for this right-wing male leadership to step up
Totally.
and be an example of strong men, and masculinity still exists. So with that vacuum, we aren't able to see strong male leaders who are liberal and
Mhm.
progressive. And so it's like we need more of that in the world. And it's okay for masculinity to exist and to be strong and to be leaders, but to also use our voices to support women, to support minorities,
Have
and try
empathy.
and make change.
Totally.
Yeah. So I just thought that was really
I,
interesting, and it was like a cool.
I think that theory is pretty spot on, and
Yeah.
I think there's merit to it because I think the reason why a lot of young men probably voted for Trump in this election is because of just that. The men kind of on the maybe on more on the liberal point of view have taken a little bit of a step back, and so these younger men don't feel like they have anybody who they can necessarily relate to. In some cases, I think they do even maybe feel like demonized a little bit, and so it's like,
Yeah.
oh well, that messaging I don't really like that. So then
Mhm.
again, coming back to loneliness and just looking for community. Oh, these guys over here are telling me it's okay to be the way that I am. And even though
Mhm.
some of their other ideas are not great, at least that messaging is being targeted at them. Or,
Hmm.
Mhm.
then you can start to slip down into more potentially radical ideas and things like that. But once that entrance has been made into that community, then you don't want to leave because
Yeah.
again,
Yep.
that's just human nature.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you're more susceptible to ideas that maybe you wouldn't have been before.
For
'Cause,
sure.
yeah, I
Yeah.
just think it's ridiculous. We've talked about this before. I think the ideal role model is somebody like Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. It's like, and what qualities does he show? Sure, he shows all like the traditional masculine ones like strength and he's a strong leader, but he's also shows like a ton of empathy and stands up
Mhm.
for those who need it.
Hmm.
Yep.
And those are the qualities that I want to emulate as a man
Oh yeah.
myself.
For
So,
sure. I love that.
The only
I
thing you're missing is the long hair, Blake.
yeah, I'll grow it out.
I had something come to mind. I remember a meditation calm app from forever ago. How to love the ones who are like the hardest to love. But I remembered some line from it that was really like stuck with me. It was like there's this idea of love being this really weak thing. In actuality, like love is the hardest thing to do, like especially with someone who is like a difficult person to like engage with or to be in contact with. To actually feel those feelings for a person, like it's vulnerable, it's difficult, it's not like an easy thing. And for us to just dismiss love as like this weak thing is pretty detrimental to all of society. But
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
and love is like one of the strongest forms of connection, that thing that we all want.
yeah.
And it's
Mhm.
there's another theme from the book. It was like loneliness and love. They're a lot of times they can be kind of seen as like opposite things, but really they're both things that are pulling us towards pulling or pushing us towards connection. So loneliness is a response to us feeling a disconnect from a community or from a partner. And love is like a pull to find that connection. Again, just coming back to what we need as human beings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And on the loneliness to track, and in the book, you mentioned like the experiments they were doing on monkeys, which are awful. Like I've
Yeah.
assigned in class a few times of like to read through what these experiments were. What came to mind when you were like, oh yeah, and they this doctor or whatever separated monkeys from their pack, and then then like reintegrating them. I my brain went to like that was what COVID was. Like we were all isolated. Every
Yeah.
single one of us was isolated. And then we're just supposed to come back and be like, let's hang out. Let's spend time together. And
Yeah.
like we spent a year or more like just being like, are we allowed to be like seeing each other right now?
I think back on COVID and I think of it and I bet it was super, super lonely for a lot of people, but it actually felt like one of the first times where life felt a little less lonely for me in what I was looking for because we were all doing Zoom calls regularly, and that was filling my bucket in connection and community in a way that we hadn't been doing for a long time because we were too busy to do it. And so that for me was really special. And then on top of that, the pace slowed down in a way where I was actually able to keep up and felt like I was able to like go on walks outside and really just enjoy. So it felt like sort of the introverts right balance, at least for me. I don't know if you experienced that, Blake, but
Yeah, there were definitely periods during COVID where I was like, this is more my speed for sure.
Mm.
I did the same things. Like obviously we and some of our other friends were doing, Zoom meetings and
Yeah.
talking like once a week or more, connecting that way. I also went on a lot of walks. I didn't have to travel for work. So
Mhm.
I was like feeling a lot more relaxed because of that. Um, so in that sense, it was good. But I do agree that COVID was very isolating for a lot of
Mhm.
people, and that probably is what pushed. I think there are a lot of reasons, but the whole like MAGA movement, probably a lot of
Right.
people are like, oh, I can like glob onto this community because right now I'm feeling isolated and feeling like I'm part of this. At least I feel some connection.
Yeah. The government is
Um,
isolating me.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
Not to
Yeah.
keep me
right,
safe,
yeah. And then
control
you
me.
exactly. Yeah. So then you look to this group that's saying that message and then yeah, you feel connected to them. So
Mm.
Mhm. Mhm.
Blair, what was your were you similar during COVID or
Yeah,
was it
it's
harder for
hard.
you?
It's hard to
Because you're an introvert, but you also really thrive on I feel like that more of that personal in-person connection.
yeah, no, I absolutely love in-person stuff. I think I'm an ambivert. I think there are times where I'm like, I need like my alone time. I need to recharge. But then I've got enough of that in my system. I'm like, okay, sweet. Let's find a concert and let's go dancing and yeah, just
Yeah.
I love that side of things. So it was difficult for me in that sense. Like those events weren't happening, and yeah, when they were, it was still like this weird like I don't think I should be going to that, and like I don't even remember if there were any that I actually attended during that time. But yeah, it's difficult talking about COVID because I'm like it was such a miserable time for so many. But like
Yeah.
my experience was the company I was working for was an at-home fitness company. So it's like never gonna have a better
Yeah.
business model
Yeah.
for a time in human history. So I was like, this is pretty great. And then like all my work could be done over on Zoom, and yeah, so it wasn't. Yeah, it was just a weird time. It was a weird time. But
Yeah.
yeah, like
Yeah.
as far as the introverted side, like that was pretty great. Like I was down Friday nights doing a Zoom call with you guys, which I think we did
Mhm.
weekly, right? For a while,
Yeah.
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
several
Pretty
months.
regular.
Yeah, that was really fun. Or I mean,
It
I
was
missed
fun. It
that.
was fun until it wasn't, and then
Yeah.
we had some friendship drama, but
Yeah.
that's
Yep.
for another.
It's
That's a
another
whole
episode.
series.
Yeah.
The other thing about COVID was a lack of physical connection because you could
Yeah.
still do yeah, you could connect via Zoom or whatever, but being able to like touch people is very important.
Yeah.
And lucky for, us to have like partners at the time that could maybe fulfill that need, but for some people who were maybe totally isolated at that time, yeah, I imagine that
Uh,
was
Yeah,
very, very
exactly.
difficult just not having that total lack of physical connection.
yeah.
Yep,
Talking
it was.
about the book that you read, that being in your 80s, and having that
Mhm.
time of your life during COVID just must have been so difficult. Like if you were alone or like didn't have your spouse anymore or something like that, just
Mhm.
Yeah, it must have been so difficult. We have some neighbors like that, and I was just like, I wonder what their day to day is like and how they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple other takeaways were that we tend to romanticize like older time periods, maybe pre-social media, because we think social media has in many cases done, I think, done damage in terms of how we connect. It's also done a lot of good. There's good and bad there, but a lot of people do attribute like social media to having FOMO. Oh, I see other people having fun and I'm missing out. So having a sense of loneliness there. And so people tend to think, oh, before the internet, before social media, people were so much more connected. They were so much more integrated with their communities. But it wasn't always the case. I mean, the author shares a story of her dad who would like, he had like a CB radio, like a truck radio, and would be constantly tweaking the dials to try to find voices of truckers or just other people, not even necessarily to communicate with, but just to hear their voices. And I mean, it just sounded like a very like lonely moment of like just reaching out for this any type of human connection. And so I think we do romanticize the older times a little bit, but maybe that's not exactly accurate, because I do think loneliness is just kind of part of the human experience, and we all have periods of loneliness in our lives, whether we have community or don't. But what do you guys think? I mean, is it obviously? I think loneliness creates a purpose, but do we have to always have periods of loneliness? Do you think there's anyone who ever doesn't?
Yeah, I was gonna say
Nah.
the definitely the romanticization of you know what I'm saying, of
Romanticization.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that was right. Of like previous time periods and not being as lonely is a huge portion of that. I saw something recently that was like the biggest lie that sitcoms ever told me was like showing adults eating breakfast together before lunch or before going to work. And
Yeah.
it's like it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, of course. No one ever does that. Like, you see Friends episodes where Ross is like eating their cereal and stuff and they're all getting ready for work. It's like, who's doing this? Or like,
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah.
or you live across the hall from your friends. Like that was all like the
Her.
dream. But that never happens in real life. Like, well,
Mhm.
maybe it does,
Well,
but very
yeah.
rarely.
It does. Yeah. I mean, yeah, there are people who live in like communes and intentional living communities that probably have some version of that, or they're living in like we were living when we were living in St. Louis, we were living above some friends of ours, and we didn't like end up ever really doing any of that stuff that you see in TV shows. We were very
Yeah.
private, barely hung out, but like super close friends. So that reality doesn't actually, I think, exist in that
Mhm.
way, but there are ways
Yeah.
to build, more intentional communities.
Yeah.
The one thing I wanted to say when you were mentioning the idea of needing to, or whether we need to be experiencing loneliness or not, is I have some experiences with loneliness where I really enjoy the experience of loneliness, and it can be intentional loneliness. Sometimes that I'm feeling lonely or feeling sad, but some of my favorite things to do are to like go and like sit and just listen to music and be lonely and like let the music help me process emotions or whatever it is. I just feel like sometimes I don't want to villainize loneliness as like this thing that we shouldn't do. Like being lonely allows you to process. I went and did a 10-day silent meditation retreat, and in that I was extremely extremely lonely, but it was intentional in order to process and
Guess I will
discover things.
I would like to maybe challenge that because I think maybe there is a difference between like being like alone and lonely. Like,
Yes.
because
Right.
I fucking
That's a good
love being
point.
alone. Like,
Right. That's a good
I
point.
have so much fun. I like do dance parties by myself, put on some music, and like,
Mm. Hell
oh
yeah.
man, I have great time. I was used to be on Snapchat a little bit. I film myself like a funny face filter, lip syncing to something and send it to friends. Like, I love being alone, but like. But lonely, I think, is yeah, well, maybe there's some aspect of it because like when you're lonely, then you are starting to feel the feelings of
Right.
like that you might need to process through. So yeah, that's
Well, and
right.
you just kind of prove that too, Blair, because you said that you would take these pictures and send them to your friends, which is in a way reaching
Right.
out for connection to,
Yeah.
avoid that loneliness in a sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's
That's
true.
that's a good call out. That's a good call. I know. I think what you're hitting on there at the end, Blair, is true. Like I think that part of being lonely, if you can experience and process the loneliness, I think kind of like Blake's moment, where you were really sort of sob crying in Chicago is an example of being lonely and then giving yourself an opportunity to process the loneliness
Yeah.
and to cry. And then that then allowed you to make a decision. Okay, no, something's got to change. So
Yeah.
that's sort of the point of like what I'm trying to get at is I think that processing is really important. So giving yourself that opportunity is
Yeah, and loneliness
Totally.
creates that
Yeah.
opportunity is I think what you were saying.
because you could be lonely and you could be scrolling on distracting and distracting, and you just don't give yourself a chance to process anything. You can go through
Yeah.
so many days, so many years without even realizing that you have been lonely and alone, but not doing anything about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's your body is like giving you a message. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we need to like sit in that. Yeah, I agree, Jamie. We don't need to like villainize loneliness because as we're talking about it, it's an experience that every human being has at some
Yeah.
point or another, or has multiple periods. In that sense, that kind of connects us as human
Mm-hmm.
beings, that we all have this shared experience of loneliness. But that I think when, to your point, like being able to process something like that, your body, your something in your chemistry is sending you a message, and just being able to sit in that and be like, what does this mean? How does this really make me feel like? And yeah, do I need to then, once I've kind of processed through it, what am I doing about it? And maybe
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. Yeah.
one of the other downsides of social media is it is so easy to distract yourself nowadays from like just sitting in that and figuring it out.
What's coming to
Mm-hmm.
mind is loneliness and boredom are kind of like similar ideas, and
Yeah.
one can become bored and alone equals loneliness, it feels like. Because if you're alone and you're doing things, you're not necessarily like feeling that loneliness. But if you're bored and you're alone, you're
Yeah.
like, well, shit, man, I want to be doing other things. I want to be with people.
Yeah.
That just came to mind real quick. And then like the social media and other apps and such that are like just commoditizing our like loneliness and our boredom is
Yeah.
pretty tragic.
Yeah, it's so
Mhm.
tragic. They're taking advantage of us. I
And that's
associate
what,
boredom with creativity a little bit too. I think that when we're bored, we tend to find ways to alleviate that, and it allows for more creativity to exist. So I think that's also very needed, and something that gets me to write songs or do something that I've been wanting to do for a long time is that boredom.
Yeah,
yeah.
I agree with that.
I was gonna say, I think at some point we need to do, I don't know if it's a full episode, but like a deep dive on your 10-day experience, Jamie, because that was like a true disconnect from all of those distractions.
Yeah,
Um,
my
and I
my
know we've talked
true
about doing like a week hiatus from social media as like a
yeah
small group here and talk about that experience,
yeah
which would be interesting as well. But you
yeah.
you
I
took
would
it to
love
the extreme with that
yeah.
10-day experience.
I would love for all of us to experience the 10-day and then do a podcast episode about it. That would be awesome. But I would be happy to do an episode about my experience, and then maybe that would influence you to go do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good idea for sure. What would be a good way to like leave, or what's a good way to leave some of our listeners with some like, do we have any advice that we could share about sort of working through loneliness or getting out of it? You guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Blake, I think you gave a good example of what it takes to start working out of that loneliness, but it's to sit and feel it, not to find a distraction necessarily of social media or anything else, but just sit and feel the loneliness. And I think once you maybe start feeling that, I think you can start taking action and moving towards finding a new community or finding a community near you. I don't know, something like that might be
Yeah.
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah, and I like the idea that loneliness isn't something that has to be villainized, like you said, Jamie. It's
Yeah.
it's part of the human experience for everybody, and it's just a way that our mind is communicating something to us. So I agree that sitting in that and recognizing it is not saying like, oh, there's something wrong with me because I'm feeling lonely. The important part is to not try to distract yourself from it and just figure out what that's trying to tell you. Because yeah, I think that's the only way you can really start to figure out what you need to, address it. But it doesn't have to be something that's looked at negatively.
Yeah,
Yeah.
even within that
I'll,
same idea of like of feeling, like if you even feel yourself, like we've described in this episode of like, oh, I kind of want to make that connection with someone who's near me, like what'd you say, the other dads in your group,
in your co-op.
um, yeah, like feel that, like okay, there is a pull towards wanting to do that. It's like, all right,
Right.
I should just try that, and then you can work from that. I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think just knowing that others are probably experiencing the same thing that you might be experiencing, and that maybe they are looking for you to be the one to make that connection.
Most of the
Yeah.
time.
I'll add one more plug towards, because this whole podcast is an effort to destigmatize like therapy and that sort of space too, that something like a group therapy experience would be a really good place to build a sense of community. And also looking at some of our experiences in our past with loneliness, if we had been going through therapy, it might have, I don't know if this is true, but I might have alleviated having to, like Blake, in your case, like hit rock bottom. Like you would have been maybe in a position to be processing through and talking to somebody and making decisions from a more intentional place. So it could help avoid some of that pain. But
For sure.
go do it if it feels like something that you're comfortable with. Because I love therapy. It's
Also,
awesome.
do it if you're something you also don't necessarily know you'll feel comfortable with, because I don't think anybody feels comfortable with therapy off the bat.
Yeah, right. That's a good
Yeah,
point.
I think actually knowing going into it that it might feel a little uncomfortable.
A lot.
We didn't talk about the didn't get a chance to talk about it too much, but yeah, I did a men's group as well. That was incredibly helpful, but I definitely felt a little uncomfortable going into those sessions, especially the first couple of times. So, like that's totally a normal feeling to have of just like anytime you're trying something new, it's going to feel a little uncomfortable. And if you go through it and it doesn't feel good after a little while, then you can always stop. But I agree. I think that therapy and finding community in other ways is incredibly helpful.
Well, cool.
Cool.
That's a great place to end, I think.
Yeah,
I agree.
sure. Thank you all for listening. And hopefully this episode made you feel a little bit more part of our community and a little less lonely.
Yeah, love that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.